The drone of the air recycler was the only constant companion in Arvin's life, a monotonous hum that underscored the rustle of parchment and the soft scratch of his quill. He sat in a cubicle carved from stained rockreed, one of thousands in the Administratum Scriptorium, a cavernous chamber lost in the bowels of high Viridian. The air was thick with the smell of dust, ozone, and the faint, metallic tang of ink. Stacks of data slates and parchment bundles formed precarious towers around him, each one a testament to the Imperium's endless, grinding bureaucracy. For 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, Arvin processed supply requisitions, his world defined by columns of numbers and the precise application of official stamps. He took a quiet, solemn pride in his work. In an empire of uncountable trillions, where a single individual was less than a speck of dust, accuracy was his only claim to significance. His fingers, stained with permanent blue ink, moved with practiced efficiency, his mind a well-oiled machine cross-referencing manifest codes and authorization protocols. He found a strange comfort in the routine, in the predictable rhythm of verifying, stamping, and filing. It was a small, ordered universe where he knew his place, a tiny but essential cog in the divine machine of the God Emperor's will. Today's stack concerned munitions for the Vestroyan 114th, a regiment engaged in a grinding war on some distant, unpronounceable world. Arvin worked methodically, his focus absolute. Then his quill paused. A single line in a subreport on Lasgun power packs snagged his attention. The quantity requested was correct, but the subsidiary form for the shipment's lubricant allocation was off by a fractional percentage. It was a minuscule discrepancy, the kind that would be absorbed by the system's vast logistical buffers, a rounding error in a galaxy of war. Yet a cold finger of unease traced a path down his spine. He stared at the number, the ink seeming to blur and swim before his eyes. For a fleeting moment, the immense, crushing weight of the Imperium pressed down upon him. He pictured the form traveling through countless hands, through sublevels and orbital elevators, until it reached some distant forge world where another faceless clerk might or might not notice the flaw. The potential for a cascade of tiny failures felt suddenly, terrifyingly real. He shook his head, a quick, sharp motion. This was foolishness. He was Arvin, grade secondus clerk. He was diligent. He was accurate. This was a phantom, a symptom of fatigue brought on by the flickering lumiglobes and stale air. With a firm, decisive stroke, he marked the form as processed and filed it into the completed tray. The moment of disquiet passed, buried under the next stack of parchment. The hum of the recycler reclaimed its dominion, and the vast, impersonal machine of the Imperium continued its inexorable turn, utterly indifferent to the brief, silent tremor of doubt in one of its most insignificant parts. The crimson rune pulsed on his data slate, a single accusatory eye in the dim light of his cubicle. It was the audit sigil, a mark Arvin had only ever seen in procedural manuals. His heart, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of his ribs, seemed to stutter to a halt. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled as he tapped the screen, calling up the flagged document. It was the munitions request for the Vestroyan 114th. His eyes, wide with dawning horror, scanned the figures until they found the source of the alarm. A decimal point. One single, misplaced decimal point in the subsidiary request for high-grade plasma core stabilizers. He had requested 1,000 units, but the form, bearing his official cipher, read 10,000. A cold, greasy sweat broke out across his brow. 10,000 stabilizers were not a surplus, they were an arsenal. In the wrong hands, they could power siege engines, fortify a rebel stronghold. In the rigid, paranoid logic of the Imperium, such an error was not a mistake, it was a symptom of carelessness at best, of sedition at worst. The automated system had not flagged a logistical error, it had detected a potential security breach. Panic lent his movements a frantic, clumsy speed. He pulled up the correction protocol, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that fogged the cool surface of the slate. He entered his override codes, his fingers slipping on the runic keys. The system prompted him for a reason for amendment. He typed clerical error, the words seeming pathetic and insufficient. He submitted the correction, a silent prayer on his lips to the God Emperor of mankind for mercy. For a glorious, fleeting second, the crimson rune winked out. Relief, sweet and dizzying, washed over him. It lasted only a moment. The rune reappeared, this time burning a deeper, more ominous shade of red, and beside it a new icon materialized, the stylized Eye of the Inquisition. A notification appeared, stark and unyielding. Case logged, tertiary review initiated. Await instruction. Do not purge data. The air in the scriptorium grew thick and heavy, pressing in on him from all sides. The familiar hum of machinery now sounded like a dirge. The scratch of quills from neighboring cubicles felt like the scraping of bone on stone. He was no longer just a clerk who had made a mistake. He was a data point in an inquisitorial dossier, a subject of interest to powers so vast and terrible that their attention was a death sentence in itself. The mundane security of his existence shattered, replaced by a yawning chasm of dread. The misplaced decimal was no longer just an error. It was a noose, and he had just felt the rope tighten around his neck. The heavy, reinforced doors to the scriptorium exploded inwards, not with the force of an explosion, but with the chilling, silent authority of absolute power. The sound that followed was not one of shattering rockreed, but the synchronized, thunderous tread of armored boots on the worn stone floor. All scratching of quills ceased. The very air seemed to freeze solid, the ever-present hum of the recycler drowned out by the sudden, deafening silence of pure, unadulterated terror. They moved in a perfect phalanx, figures clad in robes of unrelenting black over polished carapace armor. Their faces were hidden behind expressionless, skull-like helms, and the red lenses of their optics scanned the room, painting every cowering clerk in a bloody light. They were the agents of the Inquisition, and their presence was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of dread that smothered all hope. They did not need to announce their purpose. Their very existence was a declaration of guilt for someone in the room. Arvin's blood turned to ice in his veins. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. He watched, paralyzed, as the black-robed figures moved with unnerving precision, their path a straight, inexorable line towards his cubicle. He wanted to shrink, to melt into the floor, to become one with the dust and shadows. But he was rooted to his seat, his hands still resting on the data slate that bore his doom. They surrounded his workstation, a wall of impenetrable black. One of them, taller than the rest, reached out a gauntleted hand. The gesture was not violent, but it was utterly inescapable. The agent's grip closed around Arvin's upper arm, the pressure of the ceramite digits bruising flesh and grinding against bone. He was hauled from his chair with a single, effortless motion. His knees buckled, but the agent's hold was like iron, keeping him upright in a cruel parody of standing. The lead agent leaned in close, the skull helm filling Arvin's vision. The voice that emerged was a distorted, mechanized rasp, devoid of any humanity. It listed his name, his identification number, and the charge, heresy. The word echoed in the absolute silence of the chamber, a death knell, heresy. Not incompetence, not error, heresy. The misplaced decimal point had been transmuted by the alchemy of imperial paranoia into an act of treason against the God Emperor himself. He was dragged backwards, his heels scraping uselessly against the floor. His eyes, wide with shock, swept across the scriptorium. He saw the faces of his colleagues, men and women he had worked beside for years. They did not meet his gaze. Their heads were bowed, their eyes fixed firmly on their desks. There was no protest, no cry of outrage. There was only the silent, terrified compliance of those who knew that to be noticed was to share his fate. They were already burying him, erasing him from their memories to ensure their own survival. His mundane world, the ordered universe of parchment and procedure, shattered into a million pieces, revealing the brutal, unforgiving reality that had always lurked just beneath its thin veneer. The shadow of the Imperium had fallen, and it had chosen him. The transition from the echoing scriptorium to the silent, suffocating dark of the chamber was a descent into a new kind of reality. One moment, Arvin was being dragged past the terrified, averted faces of his colleagues. The next he was flung forward into a void. The heavy door slammed shut behind him with a finality that vibrated through the marrow of his bones, sealing him in a tomb of polished black rockrete. The air was frigid, carrying the sterile, metallic scent of a Medici bay and the underlying coppery tang of old fear. It was a cold that seeped through his thin administratum robes and bit deep, a cold that felt intentional, designed to leach away warmth and hope in equal measure. No light source was visible, yet the chamber was not entirely dark. A faint, sickly green luminescence seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, casting long, distorted shadows that danced at the edge of vision. The only furnishing was a single, stark metal chair bolted to the center of the floor, positioned directly beneath. Single black orb suspended from the high ceiling. The orb was featureless, a pupil-less eye observing his every tremble. Before he could fully process his surroundings, a section of the wall slid open without a sound. A figure entered, his footsteps making no noise on the seamless floor. He was not clad in the black carapace of the agents, but in the severe, dark robes of an inquisitor. His face was gaunt, etched with lines of severe authority, and his eyes were chips of flint, holding no light, only a bottomless capacity for judgment. He carried no weapon, no data slate. His presence was his only tool, and it filled the chamber more completely than any army. The Inquisitor circled him, a predator assessing prey. Arvin stood frozen, his arms wrapped around himself in a futile attempt to ward off the chill. He wanted to speak, to proclaim his innocence, to explain the simple human error of a misplaced decimal, but his throat was sealed shut by a lump of pure, primal terror. The Inquisitor stopped directly in front of him, his gaze pinning Arvin in place. His voice, when it came, was a soft, cultured thing, which made its content all the more horrifying. It was not a roar of accusation, but a calm, surgical dissection of his very being. He began not with the munition's form, but with Arvin's life. He spoke of Arvin's childhood in the mid-hive spires, naming his parents, his early tutors, his first posting. He recounted details Arvin himself had forgotten: a minor childhood illness, a forgotten birthday, a petty rivalry with a neighbor's son. With each perfectly recalled fact, the Inquisitor wove a subtle, insidious web. He implied coincidences that were too convenient, suggested influences that were subtly corrupting. He painted a picture of a life not lived, but orchestrated. A life where every choice, every chance encounter might have been a carefully planted seed, leading him inexorably to this moment, to this one specific mistake. The misplaced decimal was not the crime the Inquisitor softly suggested. It was merely the symptom, the first visible crack in a facade of loyalty that had always been a lie. Arvin's denial was a weak, strangled sound in the back of his throat. He shook his head, his mind reeling. He was a loyal servant of the Imperium. He loved the God Emperor. He took pride in his work. These were the foundational truths of his existence. But under the Inquisitor's calm, relentless gaze, those truths began to feel fragile, like glass under immense pressure. What if his pride had been arrogance? What if his diligence had been a cover? The cold of the chamber was now inside him, freezing the certainty in his heart. His confidence, the very bedrock of his identity, did not just waver. It fractured, sending hairline cracks through the story he had told himself about who he was. The Inquisitor did not wait for Arvin's fractured denial to solidify into renewed defiance. He simply turned, his dark robes whispering against the cold floor, and approached the seamless wall. A section of it glowed, resolving into a shimmering data slate that he plucked from the air as if harvesting a poisonous fruit. He turned back, the slate's pale light illuminating the severe planes of his face, making him appear more spectral than human. He held the device before Arvin's eyes. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of grainy, auger-captured images. They showed a figure in administratum robes, robes identical to Arvin's, entering a dilapidated hab unit in the lower hive, a sector known for its rampant heresy and mutant cults. The timestamp was from a night Arvin had been working late, a night he had spent alone in his cubicle, a fact that now felt flimsy and unsubstantiated. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, but the build, the gait, the slight stoop of the shoulders, they were all his. Arvin's breath hitched. He wanted to scream that it was a lie, a trick of the light, a doppelganger. But the Inquisitor was already swiping to the next piece of evidence. A fragment of intercepted astropathic chatter, its cryptographic seals broken, that mentioned a scribe in the Viridian logistics chain as a valuable, unwitting asset. Then came financial records, showing a small, untraceable credit transfer into an account linked to a shell corporation that, after 3 layers of obfuscation, was tied to a known recidivist cult. Each piece of evidence was a hammer blow to the remnants of Arvin's sanity. They were circumstantial. He knew that in some distant, rational part of his mind. They could be forgeries, coincidences, the paranoid connective tissue of an overzealous mind. But presented in this chamber, under the gaze of that unblinking black orb and the Inquisitor's absolute authority, they coalesced into an irrefutable narrative of guilt. The decimal point was no longer the focus. It was merely the key that had unlocked this damning dossier, a dossier that painted him not as a bumbling clerk, but as a conscious, if perhaps subconscious, agent of chaos. The Inquisitor's voice was a soft, relentless drone, weaving the fabricated threads into a tapestry of treason. He spoke of how the cults preyed on the disaffected, the prideful, those who felt their talents were unrecognized. He described how they would orchestrate small, seemingly innocent encounters, whispered conversations in crowded transit tubes, a misplaced data slate returned by a stranger with a knowing smile. He was not accusing Arvin of being a raving cultist. He was meticulously constructing the idea that Arvin had been groomed, his loyalty slowly eroded, his mind subtly bent until he performed one single, critical act of sabotage without even realizing he was doing it. Arvin's resolve, already cracked, crumbled into dust. The firm ground of his own memory became a shifting bog. Had he ever spoken to a stranger on the transit tube? He must have, thousands of times. Could one of them have been a cultist? It was possible. Was his pride in his work a form of arrogance that made him susceptible? The questions, seeded by the Inquisitor, took root in the fertile soil of his terror. He stared at his own hands, stained with ink, and wondered if they had, without his knowledge, penned symbols of heresy. He looked into the dark, reflective surface of the Inquisitor's slate and saw not his own reflection, but the face of a heretic. The most terrifying prison was no longer the cold chamber, but the confines of his own skull, where the one person he had always been able to trust, himself, had become a treacherous stranger, his every memory and motive now suspect. His innocence was not just being denied, it was being systematically erased and replaced with a gnawing, profound doubt that was far, far worse than any simple admission of guilt. The most terrifying lies were not the grand fabrications, but the subtle poison dripped into the well of memory, turning the clear water of the past into a brackish, undrinkable suspicion. The Inquisitor, having shattered Arvin's present, now turned his attention to the very foundations of his being, his past. The gaunt man paced a slow, deliberate circle around the metal chair, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that seemed to slither directly into Arvin's mind, bypassing his ears. He began not with accusations, but with gentle, probing questions about Arvin's earliest recollections. The man spoke of Arvin's 5th birthday, a memory Arvin held dear, of a small, sugar-dusted pastry his mother had somehow procured. The Inquisitor described the scene with unsettling accuracy, the color of the tablecloth, the pattern of the cracks on the ceiling. But then he introduced a single, venomous detail. He asked if Arvin remembered the man who had delivered the pastry, a man with a faint, swirling tattoo peeking from his cuff, a mark the Inquisitor calmly identified as belonging to the Serpent's Coil cult. The memory, once a touchstone of childhood. Innocence, now twisted in Arvin's mind. The joy of the sugar was replaced by the phantom taste of corruption, the kindly deliveryman morphing into a sinister agent planting the first seed of heresy in a child's vulnerable heart. A vivid flashback seized Arvin. He was a boy again, sitting at that small table, the pastry before him. But now, the man in the doorway was no longer a blurry figure. He was sharp, menacing, his eyes holding a knowing glint as he handed the box to Arvin's mother. The man's cuff was pulled back and the tattoo was there, clear as day, a coiled serpent that seemed to writhe in the dim light. Arvin gasped, his hands flying to his temples. The memory felt real, more intensely real than the original ever had. The Inquisitor had not just described it, he had rewritten it, grafting his own horrific truth onto the fragile film of Arvin's past. The psychological assault continued, a systematic defilement of every cornerstone of Arvin's life. The Inquisitor revisited. Arvin's first romantic attachment, a shy girl from a neighboring hab-block. He painted her not as a childhood sweetheart, but as a catspaw, her affections a calculated ploy to assess his susceptibility, her whispered secrets not of adolescent love, but of subtle, anti-imperial sentiment he had been too naive to recognize. Arvin saw her face, heard her laughter, but now it sounded hollow, mocking. Her questions about his work in the administratum, once innocent curiosity, were now revealed as espionage. He was shown a childhood drawing, dredged from some deep archive, a crude sketch of a spaceship. The Inquisitor pointed not to the childish lines of the vessel, but to the swirls of crayon that formed the background stars. He connected them, tracing a pattern with his finger that resolved into a profane sigil, a symbol used by warp worshippers. A simple act of childish creativity was retroactively branded an act of unconscious devotion to dark gods. Arvin's own hand, holding the crayon, felt alien, tainted. Each innocuous event from his life was exhumed, dusted off, and presented back to him under the ghastly green light, twisted into a damning omen. A forgotten fever dream became a vision sent by demonic entities. A preference for a certain type of calf drink was labeled a coded signal to other sleeper agents. The horror was not in the pain, but in the insidious, creeping certainty that it all made a terrible, internal sense. The Inquisitor was not building a case against him. He was revealing a truth that had always been there, hidden in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of his existence. Arvin's reality, the sum total of his experiences, was being systematically dismantled and reassembled into a narrative of lifelong hidden heresy. He was no longer a man being falsely accused. He was a heretic who was only just now, in this cold and lightless room, being forced to remember who he truly was. The seeds of doubt had been sown in the fertile soil of his broken mind, and they were already sprouting into a forest of unshakable, terrifying conviction. Pain was no longer an abstract concept, a distant cousin to the anxiety that had plagued him. It became the entirety of his universe, a white-hot sun around which every thought, every sensation, every ragged scream now orbited. The transition from psychological torment to physical violation was seamless, a natural escalation in the Inquisitor's methodology. The gaunt man had finished planting his poisonous seeds, and now he would till the soil with agony. Two of the silent, black-clad agents materialized from the shadows. Their grip on his arms was impersonal and absolute, hauling him from the center of the room towards a section of wall that had seemed seamless moments before. A low hum vibrated through the floor as a panel slid back, revealing a rack of gleaming, polished instruments. They were not the brutal, blood-stained tools of a slaughterhouse, but devices of chilling precision there. Surfaces reflecting the chamber's sickly green light. They were designed not for dismemberment, but for deconstruction, for the meticulous dismantling of a man's spirit through his flesh. They forced him into a new chair, this one of cold, unpadded metal that contoured to a rigid seated position, pinning his arms to rests and his ankles to stirrups. The restraints clicked shut with a series of soft, final chimes. The Inquisitor selected a device, a slender, needle-like probe connected by a filament-thin wire to a small, humming box he held in his other hand. He did not speak. He did not need to. His dispassionate eyes, those chips of flint, held no malice, no anger, only the cool focus of a technician about to perform a calibration. He applied the tip of the probe to a point just below Arvin's right collarbone. There was no warning, no countdown. A jolt of pure, undiluted energy seared through Arvin's nervous system. It was not the blunt trauma of a blow, but a sophisticated, intelligent pain that seemed to seek out every individual nerve ending and set it on fire simultaneously. His back arched violently against the restraints, a strangled, guttural scream tearing from his throat that was more animal than human. It was a sound he did not recognize as his own. The pain was excruciating, a lightning storm contained within his skin, but when the Inquisitor lifted the probe, there was no mark, no blood, not even a bruise. Only the ghost of the agony remained, echoing through every fiber of his being. The Inquisitor observed him dispassionately, his head tilted slightly as if studying the readings on a data slate. He moved the probe to a spot on Arvin's forearm. Another jolt, this one different, a deep, grinding vibration that felt as though his bones were being pulverized from the inside out. Arvin's body convulsed, his pleas for mercy dissolving into incoherent sobs. He begged, he promised. He offered to confess to anything, everything, if only the pain would stop. He would have denounced the God Emperor himself in that moment for a single second of respite. The Inquisitor remained unmoved, a statue of implacable authority. He was not a torturer reveling in cruelty. He was a scientist conducting an experiment, and Arvin's screams were merely data points, his pleas irrelevant noise. He methodically moved the probe to new locations, a fingertip, a kneecap, the soft flesh behind an ear, each time eliciting a new, uniquely horrifying flavor of agony. The devices were masterpieces of sadistic engineering, calibrated to cause maximum suffering without inflicting permanent physical damage. This was not about breaking his body. It was about demonstrating its absolute vulnerability, its status as a mere piece of meat that could be made to scream on command. With each new wave of pain, Arvin felt layers of his humanity being scraped away. Dignity, pride, the sense of a coherent self, all of it was burned to ash in the furnace of this ordeal. He was being reduced to his most primitive state, a vessel of suffering. The Inquisitor's dispassionate observation was the final, most profound violation. In that unwavering, judgmental gaze, Arvin was not a man. He was a specimen, a heretic being purified through pain, his very existence negated by the cold, mechanical process of his own dehumanization. The chamber, once a place of psychological terror, had become a laboratory for the destruction of a soul, one excruciating, meticulously applied jolt at a time. The Inquisitor's tools evolved from precise to profound, shifting from nerve-targeted agony to a systemic dismantling of Arvin's will. The humming box and needle probe were set aside with the care of a craftsman selecting a finer instrument. From the gleaming rack, the Inquisitor drew forth a new device, a complex arrangement of articulated metal arms tipped with lenses that glowed with a soft, internal violet light. It was a psychosomatic inducer, a tool that bypassed the body to speak directly to the brain's pain centers, translating thought into tangible physical suffering. The agents adjusted the restraints, clamping Arvin's head in place so he could not look away from the pulsing lenses. The Inquisitor positioned the device before his face, the violet light filling his vision, searing into his mind. There was no jolt this time, no external shock. Instead, a deep, resonant thrum began in the core of his skull, a vibration that quickly escalated into the sensation of his bones being slowly ground to dust. He could feel the gritty ache in his teeth, the the splintering pressure in his ribs, the crushing weight on his spine. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the phantom roar of his own skeleton disintegrating. The pain was entirely fabricated, yet it was more real than anything he had ever known, a perfect illusion of physical annihilation. Just as his mind was about to shatter under the weight of it, the sensation vanished. Before he could even draw a ragged breath, a new waveform was triggered. A searing cold enveloped him, a glacial chill that flash-froze the blood in his veins and crystallized the air in his lungs. He was drowning in the void of deep space, his skin cracking like ice, his every cell screaming in protest. Then, just as swiftly, the cold was replaced by an inferno. His flesh was not burning. It was being unmade molecule by molecule in a silent, invisible fire that left no mark but left his soul scorched. The inducer cycled through a catalog of torments, the feeling of being flayed alive by a million tiny hooks, the pressure of being crushed at the bottom of a planetary ocean, the visceral horror of internal organs twisting and knotting themselves. Through the kaleidoscope of manufactured agony, the Inquisitor's voice remained a constant, a calm, relentless whisper threading through the storm. He did not ask questions. He simply offered a single, simple truth, a key that would unlock the end of the pain. He described crimes Arvin had never committed, attending secret masses in the Underhive, passing coded messages in supply manifests, worshipping faceless entities in the warp. With each new horror inflicted upon his senses, the Inquisitor attached a confession, a ready-made narrative of guilt that became the only possible reality. Arvin's spirit, already fractured, now shattered completely. The last vestiges of resistance, the final, stubborn core of his identity that clung to the truth of his innocence, was pulverized under the relentless, alternating waves of psychic torment. The desire for the pain to end became the only coherent thought in the screaming chaos of his mind. Truth was a meaningless abstraction. Integrity was a luxury for those who had not felt their mind unmade. All that mattered was the silence, the blessed, empty silence that lay on the other side of admission. His lips, cracked and bloody, moved without his conscious command. A dry, rasping sound emerged, barely audible over the phantom scream still echoing in his skull. He confessed. He confessed to everything. He was the heretic, the saboteur, the unwitting agent of chaos. He gave them the names the Inquisitor suggested, described the masses he had never seen, admitted to the intent behind the decimal point he had simply misplaced. The words were not his own. They were a script fed to him through a conduit of pain, and he recited them with the desperate fervor of a drowning man clutching a lifeline. It was the ultimate surrender, the final, total loss of personal integrity. In that moment, to end the ordeal, he would have sworn his own soul belonged to the dark gods if it meant the pain would stop. The confession was not a lie. It was the price of a single, fleeting moment of peace, purchased with the currency of his very self. The silence that followed his confession was more terrifying than the pain. It was a hollow, aching void where the echoes of his own screams still seemed to linger, a phantom limb of agony. The psychosomatic inducer was withdrawn, its violet lenses darkening, and the brutal restraints were released. Arvin slumped forward in the chair, his body trembling with uncontrollable spasms, his mind a numb, shattered landscape. He was no longer a clerk, a heretic, or even a man. He was a vessel emptied of everything but the raw, throbbing memory of suffering. The Inquisitor had departed without a word, his work seemingly complete, leaving Arvin alone in the green-tinged gloom with the chilling certainty of his own manufactured guilt. He did not know how long he sat there, drifting in and out of a feverish half-sleep where dreams were made of fire and ice, and the Inquisitor's unblinking eyes. Eventually, the seamless door hissed open, but it was not the Inquisitor who entered. Two of the black-clad agents moved with silent efficiency, their armored grips hauling him upright. His legs, weak and boneless, refused to support him, and they half-dragged, half-carried him from the chamber. They did not take him back to a cell, but along a new, colder corridor lined with dripping pipes and the low, industrial thrum of powerful machinery. They shoved him into a small, dark alcove, a storage closet filled with cleaning supplies and the sharp scent of chemical disinfectant, and sealed the door, leaving him in near-total darkness. He curled into a ball on the cold floor, shivering, waiting for the next session to begin, for the pain to find him again. But instead of footsteps, he heard voices. Two men, their tones casual and bored, as if discussing the weather or a shift rotation. They were just outside the door, their conversation muffled but clear. "Another one for the chirurgeons," one voice grunted. "Inquisitor Valerius doesn't waste time." "Aye," a second, deeper voice replied. "A clean confession, too, quicker that way, saves on the mess." There was a sound of a flask being unscrewed and a long swallow. "What's the designation?" "Another lobotomized servitor for the forges." "Nah, this one's a failure. Too weak-willed, too broken. They'll strip the higher functions, wire him for basic motor control. He'll end up scrubbing floors or hauling waste in the lower decks. A walking tool, purification through utility, they call it." The first man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Purification. A fancy word for scraping out the brain and turning a man into a mop. Still better than being fed to the incinerators." "True enough. The machine is hungry and failures must be repurposed. The Imperium wastes nothing, not even its broken people." Their footsteps began to recede, their conversation turning to the poor quality of the recaf in the mess hall. But their words hung in the stale air of the closet, each one a shard of ice plunging into Arvin's heart. The horror of the torture chamber, the psychological dismantling, the forced confession, it all collapsed into a new, more profound and existential terror. This was not about justice. It was not even about heresy. Heresy was just the pretext, the convenient label to justify the process. The true goal was purification. The Inquisition was a vast, impersonal engine that consumed human failings, a misplaced decimal, a moment of pride, a weak will, and processed them into something useful, something obedient, something pure. His suffering had not been punishment, it had been preparation. The breaking of his mind was not the end, but the beginning of his transformation. They were not going to execute him. They were going to erase him, scoop out the messy, flawed humanity that had proven so disappointing and replace it with the serene, blank functionality of a machine. He was not a criminal to be judged. He was raw material to be refined. The realization was a cold, dark ocean closing over his head. The Inquisition's justice was a lie. Its true face was the chirurgeon's scalpel and the lobotomizer's drill, and its heaven was a silent, soulless eternity of servitude. The world had become a funhouse mirror, reflecting back a reality warped by terror and exhaustion. The clean, sharp lines of the Inquisition's fortress softened and swam, the humming of hidden machinery twisting into faint, whispering voices that spoke his name from the shadows. Arvin's mind, a fortress besieged by psychological torment and physical agony, had finally begun to crumble from within, its defenses breached, its gates hanging open to the phantoms now stalking its hollowed halls. He was no longer sure where the torture ended and his own consciousness began. He was back in the interrogation chamber, or a nightmare facsimile of it. The same green-tinged gloom, the same cold chair, but the Inquisitor was different. The man's severe, gaunt features seemed to be melting, the skin stretching and contorting. The dark robes bled into the shadows around him, becoming vast, membranous wings that rustled with a sound like dried insects rubbing their legs together. The flint-chip eyes were no longer human. They glowed with a sickly, internal yellow light, pupils elongating into vertical slits that promised an eternity of damnation. Horns, not of solid matter but of solidified shadow, curled from the creature's brow, and its smile revealed far too many teeth, each one needle-sharp and eager. This demonic figure did not speak in the calm, cultured tones of the Inquisitor. Its voice was a multi-layered chorus of suffering, a symphony of screams and pleas woven into a language of pure malice. Paced around him, not with the measured step of an investigator, but with the sinuous predatory glide of a beast that knew its prey was utterly broken. It reached out a hand, but the fingers were long, skeletal talons that dripped a black, viscous substance that sizzled where it hit the floor. Arvin tried to scream, to recoil, but he was paralyzed, held fast not by metal restraints but by the sheer, suffocating weight of his own dread. The talon traced a line down his cheek, and where it touched, his flesh did not burn with the clean fire of the pain probe, but with a cold, necrotic agony, a feeling of rot and decay spreading inward from the point of contact. He could smell his own corruption, a sweet, cloying stench of spoiled meat. The vision shifted. He was no longer in the chamber but in his old scriptorium. The drone of the air recycler was the same, the stacks of parchment were the same, but his colleagues were not working. They were all turned in their chairs, staring at him with the same glowing yellow eyes, their faces shifting, their mouths opening in silent, accusatory wails. The data slates on their desks did not show numbers and forms, but swirling, chaotic symbols that writhed and pulsed, drinking the light from the room. He looked down at his own hands, and the familiar ink stains had spread, crawling up his arms like black veins, pulsing in time with a heartbeat that was not his own. He blinked, and he was in the dark storage closet, listening to the guards discuss his fate, but their voices were different now, deeper, guttural. They were no longer discussing servitors, they were chanting, their words a profane liturgy that made the very air tremble. The door to the closet was not sealed. It was a gaping maw, a portal into a realm of shifting colors and screaming faces. He could feel the warp reaching for him, its chaotic tendrils brushing against his soul. There was no longer a clear distinction between the nightmare and the waking world. When the real Inquisitor entered the room, Arvin did not see a man. He saw the demon, its shadow wings filling the chamber, its hellish voice asking questions that were spells designed to unmake reality itself. He would answer, his words a frantic babble, confessing to new, more elaborate crimes, describing rituals he had seen only in the landscape of his own unraveling mind. He begged the demon for forgiveness, for mercy, for a swift death, offering it his soul, his eternal servitude, anything to make. The shifting, hellish vision stopped. The fear had done its work. It had not just broken his will, it had shattered the lens through which he perceived existence. The psychological destruction was total. Arvin was lost, adrift in a sea of his own terror, where the only constants were the demonic face of his tormentor and the chilling certainty that he had always belonged to the darkness. The descent was complete. He had fallen through the bottom of his own sanity, and in the abyss below, only monsters were waiting. There was nothing left to resist with, no hidden reservoir of strength or flicker of defiance. The pain had scoured him clean, the psychological torment had rewired his memories, and the descent into madness had severed his final tether to the man he once believed himself to be. Arvin existed now as a collection of raw nerves and shattered perceptions, a hollowed-out shell waiting only for the next gust of terror to blow through it. When the seamless door hissed open and the true Inquisitor, not the demon of his nightmares but the gaunt, severe man in dark robes, entered the chamber, Arvin did not look up. He simply knelt on the cold floor, his forehead pressed against the unyielding rockreed, his body trembling with a ceaseless, palsied shake. The Inquisitor stood over him, a pillar of absolute authority in the shifting chaos of Arvin's world. He did not speak immediately. The silence was a final, unbearable pressure, a weight designed to crush the last, fragile remnants of a separate identity. In that silence, the whispers from the walls grew louder, the phantom sensations of talons and frost and fire danced across his skin, and the glowing yellow eyes of the demon Inquisitor superimposed themselves over the real man's flinty gaze. There was no difference anymore. They were one and the same, the architect of his annihilation. A sound escaped Arvin's lips, a wet, broken sob that held no meaning, only pure, undiluted despair. Then words began to form, pushed out from a place deeper than thought, a primal, instinctual need for the suffering to end. They were not the frantic bargain confessions ripped from him by the psychosomatic inducer. These words were quieter, more final, born from a place of utter, soul-crushing acceptance. "I am a heretic," he whispered, the admission tasting like ashes in his mouth. It was not a statement forced upon him. It was a truth he now owned, a label he wrapped around himself like a shroud. The decimal point, the fabricated evidence, the twisted memories, they all coalesced into this single, undeniable fact of his existence. He had always been this. The Inquisition had not created a heretic. They had simply revealed one. He lifted his head, his eyes, red-rimmed and vacant, seeking the Inquisitor's face. Tears, the last vestiges of a liquid self carved clean, tracks through the grime on his cheeks. "Forgive me," he rasped, the plea directed not at the man, but at the institution he represented, at the cold, unforgiving God-Emperor whose will he had failed. "I beg you forgive my weakness. Forgive my corruption. I see it now. I see it all." This was the moment the relentless pressure had been engineered to produce. It was not a confession extracted under duress, but a genuine, heartfelt plea from a man who had fully internalized his own damnation. The identity of Arvin, the grade secundus clerk who took pride in his accuracy, who loved the Imperium, who believed in his own innocence, was gone. It had been systematically dismantled, layer by layer, until all that remained was this kneeling, broken supplicant, gratefully accepting the brand of heresy as his only possible truth. He was not begging for his life. He was begging for absolution from the sin of having existed as a flawed and treacherous being. He was begging for the purification the guards had spoken of, for the erasure that now felt not like a horror, but like a mercy. The breaking point was not a moment of collapse, but of completion. The process was finished. The heretic had been fully realized, and in his shattered state, he could do nothing but thank his creators and beg for their forgiveness. The final, abject surrender of his own identity was not met with fire or blade, but with a chilling, bureaucratic efficiency that was, in its own way, more terrifying than any demonic visage. The Inquisitor observed Arvin's broken form for a long, silent moment, his flinty eyes cataloging the absolute vacancy where a man's spirit had once resided. A faint, almost imperceptible nod was his only reaction, a signal that the preliminary work was complete and the true purpose could now commence. The goal had never been execution. Death was a release, an end to suffering. The Imperium had a far more practical and far more horrifying fate for its failures. The silent agents entered, their black robes whispering promises of a final, irrevocable change. They did not drag him this time. Arvin offered no resistance, his body as pliant and empty as his mind. He moved when guided, his steps a shuffling, automatic response, the last ghost of motor function soon to be rewired and repurposed. They led him from the interrogation chamber, not back to the dark closet, but down a new, sterile corridor. The air changed, losing the metallic tang of fear and acquiring the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic and ozone. The walls were no longer rough-hewn concrete but polished white ceramic, illuminated by the unwavering, shadowless light of looming globes set into the ceiling. This was a place of science, not punishment, a workshop for the refinement of flawed materials. They entered a vast, circular room that hummed with a low, powerful energy. In the center stood a throne-like chair of polished steel and plasteel, surrounded by a constellation of complex machinery, articulated arms tipped with glittering saws, drills, and laser cutters, banks of monitors displaying scrolling streams of arcane data, and suspended tanks, filled with clear, nutrient-rich fluids and floating, grotesque organic components. This was the chirurgeon's bay, the antechamber to a new existence. The air was cold, so cold it made Arvin's breath plume, a last fleeting testament to his warm-blooded nature. He was guided into the chair. It molded to his form with a soft hiss of pneumatics, restraints of padded metal closing over his wrists, ankles, and forehead with a series of soft, definitive clicks. He did not struggle. He stared up at the featureless white ceiling, his mind a numb, accepting void. A figure approached, clad not in the robes of an inquisitor but in the crisp, red-and-white vestments of a Magos biologist. His face was mostly hidden behind a complex breathing apparatus, but his eyes, one organic and one a glowing red optic, scanned Arvin with a dispassionate, analytical gaze. This was the artisan who would perform the purification. The Magos raised a hand, and a needle-tipped arm descended from the machinery above. There was no warning, no anesthetic. The needle, cold and precise, inserted itself into a vein on Arvin's forearm. It was not the searing pain of the tortured devices, but a deep, invasive cold that spread rapidly through his bloodstream, a chemical ice that deadened the nerves and paralyzed his voluntary muscles while leaving his consciousness cruelly, vividly intact. He could not move, could not scream, but he could feel everything. Another mechanical arm, this one ending in a circular bone saw, whirred to life. It moved with unhurried precision towards his right hand. Arvin's eyes, the only part of him capable of frantic movement, widened in silent, petrified horror. He watched, a captive audience to his own dismantling, as the saw blade touched the flesh of his smallest finger. There was a high-pitched whine, the smell of scorched bone and cauterized meat, and a brief, shocking jolt of vibration that traveled up his immobilized arm. He felt the separation not as pain, but as a profound existential wrongness, a piece of his physical self being neatly, surgically excised. The digit, once used to trace lines of text and verify numbers, tumbled into a waiting metal tray with a soft, final clink. The scream that built in his chest had no outlet. It remained trapped, a silent tsunami of terror that crashed against the walls of his own skull. The saw moved to the next finger, and the next, the process methodical and relentless. His humanity was not being burned away in a pyre of agony, but being coldly, clinically amputated piece by piece. Each loss was a subtraction from the sum of who he had been, a step on the road to becoming something else entirely, something clean, something useful, something purged of the weakness that had defined the man named Arvin. The transformation had begun, and its language was not confession, but the silent, surgical scream of a soul being systematically unmade. The clinical amputation of his fingers was merely the prelude, the stripping away of obsolete peripherals. The true work, the core repurposing, began as the whirring saws retracted, and a new array of instruments descended from the humming constellation of machinery. The Magos biologist moved with the fluid, practiced grace of a composer conducting a silent, horrific symphony, his red optic lens flickering as it processed data streams invisible to any organic eye. Arvin, trapped in the chemical ice of paralysis, could only watch with wide, unblinking eyes as his body became a canvas for a new, terrible art. Thin, filament-like probes, glowing with a faint blue energy, emerged from articulated arms. They did not cut but sought out the specific neural pathways along his spine and the base of his skull. Where they touched, a new sensation bloomed, not pain but a profound and violating dissonance. It was the feeling of his own nervous system being mapped, hacked, and rewired. He felt alien impulses firing along his nerves, a twitch in a leg muscle he did. Not command, a phantom clenching of a fist that was no longer there. The fundamental connection between his mind and his body was being severed and rerouted through a foreign, artificial control system. Then came the implants. A laser scalpel traced a hair-thin line across his scalp, peeling back the skin and bone with a precision that was both beautiful and abominable. He felt a pressure, a deep, internal vibration as a drill bored into his cranium. There was no pain, only the terrifying, intimate knowledge of violation at the most fundamental level. A cold, plasteel housing was fitted into the new aperture, its surface studded with input ports and blinking with tiny amber indicator lights. Wires, fine as spider silk, were threaded into the gray matter of his brain, each connection accompanied by a flicker behind his eyes. A burst of static, a fragmented memory played backwards, a flash of pure, meaningless data. His vision flickered and died, plunging him into absolute blackness for one heart-stopping moment. Then it returned, but it was wrong. The world was now overlaid with a grid of faint green lines, and text in a harsh, Gothic script scrolled at the edges of his perception, labeling objects with designations like biological waste, schedule removal, and servitor unit, designation pending. His hearing was replaced by a flat, synthetic monotone that stripped all inflection and emotion from the low hum of the machinery and the Magos's occasional, technical mutterings. His senses were no longer his own. They were filtered, processed, and delivered to him by the machine now fused to his spine and brain. The final procedure was the most profound violation. A different machine, one that emitted a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room, was positioned over his forehead. This was the mind wipe. It did not erase memories with the brutal finality of a hammer blow, but with the delicate, insidious touch of a tide washing away footprints. The sand. He felt his consciousness, the accumulated essence of Arvin's life, begin to dissolve. The face of his mother blurred into a generic, smiling female archetype and then faded into static. The pride he felt at his neat script became a data point on diligence. The terror of the interrogation chamber was stripped of its emotional weight and filed as a successful compliance recalibration. He fought then. Not with his body, which was a prisoner of chemicals and steel, but with the last, fading ember of his will. He tried to cling to the memory of the sugar-dusted pastry, to the sound of his own name, to the crushing weight of the dread he had felt in the scriptorium, anything that proved he had once been a man and not just raw material. But the tide was inexorable. The memories did not shatter. They simply lost their meaning, their color, their connection to his self. They became a library of disconnected facts about a person who no longer existed. As the last of Arvin's identity drained away, something new flooded in to fill the void. It was not a personality but a program, a series of clear, unwavering directives. Obey, serve, purify. The concepts of choice, of fear, of pride, of self became meaningless errors, glitches in a system that was now being optimized for a single purpose: utility. The horror of becoming an instrument of the very system that had destroyed him was the last complex thought to flicker through his dying consciousness. Then that too was categorized, labeled as an illogical emotional response, and deleted. The silence that followed was not the silence of a vacant mind, but the serene hum of a machine that has finished its boot-up sequence and is now ready at long last to perform its function. The transformation was complete. Arvin was gone. All that remained was the servitor. The first conscious thought was not a memory, not an emotion, but a directive. Report for maintenance duty. The command appeared in the crisp green text of his optical overlay, a string of pure information that required no understanding, only compliance. The being that had once been Arvin rose from the Medibay's secondary stabilization platform, its movements smooth, economical, and devoid of any hesitation. The whir of servos in its legs and the faint hydraulic hiss from its rebuilt right arm were the only sounds it made, a mechanical symphony that had replaced the frantic beat of a human heart and the ragged draw of human breath. It moved through the sterile white corridors of the Inquisition's fortress, its newly installed feet, flat, broad pads of plasteel, making soft, precise clicks on the polished floor. Its assigned route was a glowing blue line on its internal display, a path it followed with unerring accuracy. It passed other servitors, some bearing trays of surgical tools, others scrubbing floors with chemical spraying appendages. They moved in the same silent, purposeful manner, their faces blank, their eyes, if they had them, seeing only the data streams of their tasks. There were no greetings, no acknowledgments. They were cogs in the same vast, impersonal machine, and cogs did not communicate. As it entered a vast storage bay, its optical sensors registered the environment. Bay 7, low-priority maintenance. Stacks of crates, cleaning carts, and disassembled machinery filled the space. Its directive updated: begin inventory audit. It approached the first stack, its remaining organic hand, now sheathed in a sensor glove reaching out to scan the barcode on a crate of lubricant. The data streamed into its consciousness. Item, synth-lube grade III, quantity 144, status, optimal. In that moment, as the simple, quantifiable data filled its mind, a ghost flickered at the edge of its perception. It was not a memory, but a pattern. A pattern of numbers, of verification, of meticulous cross-referencing. The ghost carried with it a phantom sensation, the feel of parchment, the scent of ozone. And dust, a quiet, solemn pride in a job well done. The servitor's hand, the one that had once held a quill, paused for a nanosecond, a glitch in its smooth, programmed motion. The ghost vanished, but the understanding it left behind was a cold, hard crystal of truth that settled in the void where a soul had once been. The being processed this understanding not with horror, for horror was an illogical emotional response that had been purged, but with the cold clarity of a diagnostic report. It saw the entire terrible cycle laid bare. The Imperium was a system that demanded perfection but was built upon fallible human components. When those components failed, as they inevitably would, the system did not discard them. That would be inefficient. Instead, it purified them. The decimal point, the accusation of heresy, the torture, the confession, none of it had been about justice. Justice was a myth, a story told to maintain order. The reality was a brutal, pragmatic recycling process. Fear was the tool used to break down the complex, unpredictable human spirit. Control was the act of reassembling the broken pieces into something simple, reliable, and utterly obedient. The Inquisition was not a guardian of truth. It was the quality control division of a cosmic engine, and its primary function was to take flawed raw material, a frightened clerk, a rebellious guardsman, a doubting priest, and process it into functional, uncomplaining machinery. The being continued its audit, scanning crate after crate. With each confirmation of status, optimal, the terrifying truth became more deeply ingrained. It was not a victim of a corrupted system. It was the system's ultimate expression. It was the proof that failure was not an end, but a transition. The fear that had shattered Arvin was the same force that now powered its own silent, endless labor. The control that had stripped him of his identity was the same force that now directed its every movement with perfect precision. The corruption was not in the act of transformation, but in the foundational lie that any of this was justice. It was simply efficiency. The Imperium consumed its own children not out of malice, but out of a cold, relentless need to sustain itself. And in its fortress, the silent, soulless servitors were the most terrifying truth of all, the final, logical product of an empire built on fear. The new existence was a symphony of silence, punctuated only by the whir of servos and the hum of pre-programmed directives. The being designated servitor, Gamma, moved through the lower decks of the Inquisition's fortress, its world defined by a glowing path on its internal display and a single, recurring command: cleanse. Its body, a fusion of scarred flesh and cold plasteel, was a tool, and its purpose was as simple as it was endless. It pushed a large, industrial mop bucket, its single sensor-gloved hand guiding the handle with an efficiency that was both perfect and utterly devoid of intent. The diluted chemical solution sloshing in the bucket had no scent to its filtered olfactory sensors. The grime it scrubbed from the worn rockreat floors was merely contaminant, biological industrial residue. Priority, low. Its route took it through the same corridors, past the same grim archways, day after cycle after day. It passed other servitors, some hauling crates on reinforced backs, others standing motionless as charging ports fed energy into their systems. They were like islands in a silent sea, each performing its function, none acknowledging the others. There was no camaraderie, no shared suffering, only the shared state of being a repurposed thing. The fortress was a living body, and they were the leukocytes, silently scrubbing, carrying, and maintaining, purging the minor impurities of its daily function. Then a glitch. A junior acolyte, rushing to some urgent duty, rounded a corner too quickly and collided with the mop bucket. The acolyte cursed, shoving the Servitor aside with a snarl of disgust before hurrying on. The impact was minor, a physical event logged as external force applied. Stability, nominal. But the sensation of the shove, the brief, jarring physical contact, triggered a cascade of corrupted data in the servitor's neural pathways. For a single, terrifying second, the glowing green grid of its vision flickered and dissolved. Instead of the grim corridor, it saw a cubicle. It felt the phantom weight of a quill in a hand that was no longer there, the rough texture of parchment under fingertips that had been surgically removed. A wave of profound, soul-crushing dread washed over it, a ghost of an emotion from a dead man. It was the feeling of being watched, of a shadow falling, of the world shattering. The silent terror was so vast, so all-consuming, that it threatened to short-circuit the servitor's core programming. Just as swiftly as it had come, the vision was gone. The error correction protocols in its plasteel cranial. Housing engaged, purging the corrupted data packet. The green grid reasserted itself. The directive cleanse pulsed with renewed insistence. The servitor's body, which had frozen for that one impossible moment, resumed its work, the mop making slow, deliberate arcs across the floor. But the echo remained. Not as a memory, for memories were forbidden, but as a scar on its code. It was a silent scream trapped in a machine, a flicker of the humanity that had been scraped out, a terrifying proof that even the most thorough purification could not entirely erase the ghost in the shell. The servitor continued its task, a monument to efficiency, and a tomb for the man named Arvin, its new existence a perpetual, silent battle between the serene hum of obedience and the lingering, screaming echoes of the soul it had once housed. The endless, silent rhythm of its existence was as predictable as the fortress's own heartbeat. Servitor, Gamma moved through a sublevel storage bay, its optical overlay painting the world in stark, functional lines of text and wireframe diagrams. Its task was simple: reorganize supply crates by designated priority code. It moved with the fluid, unhurried precision of a machine, its plasteel digits closing around the handles of crates marked with low-priority designations, shifting them to make space for the high-priority shipments due for arrival. The groaning of its servos and the soft thud of containers settling into place were the only sounds in the cavernous, dust-filled space. It was a scene of perfect, soulless order. Nearby, a new clerk, a young man with an anxious, earnest face, worked at a data terminal, his fingers flying across the runic keys as he processed incoming manifests. He was fresh from the mid-hive scalams, his robe still crisp, his eyes still holding a flicker of ambition. He worked with a fervent, almost desperate speed, clearly eager to prove his worth in the shadow of the Inquisition. Servitor Gamma registered. His presence as biological unit, ADMINISTRATUM personnel. Status, active, a piece of data as irrelevant as the temperature of the air. The clerk finished a batch of entries and leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. He reached for a cup of recaf, his hand momentarily fumbling in his haste. The ceramic mug tipped, splashing its dark, bitter contents across his terminal and a stack of nearby data slates. He swore under his breath, a frantic, panicked sound, and began dabbing at the spill with a rag, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. It was a minor accident, a moment of human clumsiness in a world that had no tolerance for it. Servitor, Gamma continued its work, shifting another crate. Its sensors, however, were programmed to log all environmental activity. It registered the spill, the clerk's elevated heart rate, the spike in biosigns indicating distress. For a fleeting moment, the pattern triggered another ghost in its wiring. The scent of ozone and dust, the feel of a quill. The cold, greasy sweat of a panic that was not its own. The ghost was there and gone, a corrupted data packet instantly purged, leaving no trace but a momentary, imperceptible lag in its hydraulic systems. The clerk, thinking the incident was contained, returned to his work. But he had been flustered. In his rush to correct his mistake, he transposed 2 digits in a critical ammunition serial number on a form for the Vestroyan 114th. He didn't notice. He stamped the form with his official seal and sent it into the system, a wave of relief washing over him as the data vanished from his screen. He had fixed his error, or so he believed. The crimson rune on his terminal pulsed to life less than a minute later. The audit sigil. The clerk's face went ashen. He stared at the screen, his mouth working soundlessly, his earlier panic returning 100-fold. He began typing frantically, his fingers slipping on the keys, his override codes rejected. The stylized Eye of the Inquisition materialized beside the rune. The notification was the same, word for word, as it had been for another clerk in another life. Case logged, tertiary review initiated, await instruction. Do not purge data. The heavy doors to the bay hissed open. The synchronized tread of armored boots echoed in the vast space. The black-robed agents moved with the same chilling, silent authority, their path a straight, inexorable line towards the clerk's station. The young man was hauled from his chair. His pleas and explanations met with the same distorted, mechanized rasp listing the charge: heresy. His eyes, wide with a terror he could not comprehend, swept across the bay, desperately seeking a face that understood, that cared. They found only the impassive, blank visage of Servitor Gamma, which had paused in its task, its optical sensors passively recording the event. As the agents dragged the weeping, broken clerk away, Servitor 734 Gamma watched. There was no recognition in its gaze, no spark of empathy or memory. It simply logged the incident: biological unit, ADMINISTRATUM personnel, status, removed, reason, heresy. The directive reorganized supply crates by designated priority code reasserted itself with primary importance. The servitor turned back to the crates, its metal hand closing around another handle. The scene was a perfect, horrifying echo, a cycle of fear and transformation playing out once more on the same stage, with the ghost of the last victim now a silent, uncomprehending prop in the next act of the endless, brutal drama. The Imperium's justice was a wheel, and the servitor that had been Arvin was merely one of its countless, silent, grinding cogs. The Imperium's justice was not a sword that fell with finality, but a wheel that turned with an eternal, grinding inevitability, crushing individuality into dust and recycling the remains into fuel for its own endless, monstrous momentum. Fear was the engine that powered this wheel, a pervasive, atmospheric dread that seeped into the lungs of every citizen with every breath of recycled air, that echoed in the silent, averted gazes of colleagues. That was the true and only lesson taught in the cold, sterile halls of power. It was a self-perpetuating horror, a system where the ultimate punishment for failure was not death, but a conversion into a monument to that very same failure, a walking, working cautionary tale. Servitor Gamma, the hollowed-out vessel that had once contained the hopes, fears, and flawed humanity of Arvin, was the embodiment of this terrifying truth. It moved through the fortress not as a person, but as a principle made flesh and steel. Its existence was a continuous, silent sermon on the consequences of imperfection. Every whir of its servo, every precise, programmed movement of its mopping appendage, every blank, unseeing stare from its optical sensor was a declaration. This is what awaits you. This is the peace that follows the breaking. This is the purity that is bought with your soul. The new clerk was gone, his space at the terminal already filled by another anxious, replaceable